Hello and welcome back to the Outside and Active podcast, where today I am joined by Dan Stanley. Dan, hello, how are you doing?
Hi Dom, I'm very well and I'm excited to be here to share my message.
Good, fantastic. Well, I'm looking forward to getting into this conversation, and we've had loads of guests on the podcast that have interesting stories and that can provide value. But this conversation I'm really looking forward to, because I always love it when listeners can take something from the podcast away with them, or their minds be open to something that they've either not thought about before or not really looked into a lot, and whether that directly affects you or whether it's just a piece of information that you didn't know before. So I think this conversation will tend towards that. But before we jump into you, Dan, and all of those messages and the stuff we're going to talk about, the first thing I actually have is a piece of advice for you. And it's a piece of advice that comes from someone who's been on the podcast before, and that individual is a man called Bruce Fordyce, who is a South African ultra runner, an incredibly talented ultra runner, who was also part of the team that brought Park Run to South Africa, as well as made it a success over there. And his piece of advice for you is to not be afraid to be slow, and don't be afraid to be ridiculed. Just go out there and do it. Now, that's in a running sense, but obviously you can transform that into any sense of life of, don't be afraid to go and try something new. People might judge you, or you might not be good at it to begin with, but the best thing that you can do is just to go out there and do it. So the question around that is, how do you take that? How do you take that piece of inspiration from Bruce?
I think it's a great stepping off point, Dom, because I think there's so many important messages from being outdoors in the world of sport that translate into day-to-day life. And that first part of Bruce's kind of advice about don't be afraid to be slow. One of the things that I found in my own journey, both personally and professionally, is that people often find consistency boring because there's no immediate wins. But not being afraid to go slow, whether that's in your running or whether that's in your life, as long as you're making consistent progress and you're kind of dialed in as to where you want to arrive at, then I think that's a great piece of advice. Actually, it's a really sage piece of advice, given that we're coming towards the end of a calendar year, and lots of people are probably in a reflective space.
Definitely. And I think there's a sense within society at the moment that you need to be, if you're going to do something, you need to be right up and the best at it straight away. And we're very impatient as a world at the moment. So I think it's a good piece of advice that people can take from Bruce as well. And the second question for you is, what do you love about being outside and active?
For me personally, there's many things I love about it. It enables me to reminisce around my childhood from holidays spent in a Lake District and a Peak District. It creates a sense of space when I choose to be alone in nature and outdoors by myself. Sometimes I will run or walk and I listen to podcasts or audiobooks, and sometimes I'll just be alone with my thoughts and just use that space to reflect and to consider my journey, where I'm at the moment, and particularly where I want to be in my future. And as part of, no doubt, our conversation today, we'll talk about a community project that I started called Men and Mountains, and being outdoors with a group of like-minded men, anywhere from sort of 20 to 40 men out on the hill, kind of having good, honest, quality conversation, for me is a deeply connecting experience. So yeah, kind of when you presented that question, Dom, it took me back to my childhood, and kind of, I suppose, in many respects, joins the dots all the way to where I am today.
So leading on from that, growing up in that part of the country, obviously the outdoors and nature is on your footstep. What were you like as a youngster? Were you sporty? Were you engaged with the outdoors?
Yeah, I grew up in the Northwest. I wasn't quite fortunate enough to be in the lakes, but our family holidays, a lot of those were spent either heading across to the Pennines, or on occasion going up to the Lake District. And so many memories of being in and around kind of the Honister Pass area, Seats Holler and Scarfell, all those kind of, sort of iconic areas in the Lake District. For me, kind of, I suppose, instilled values into me about the appreciation of being outdoors, about kind of being able to manage myself in often arduous situations, which undoubtedly prepared me very well for when I joined the military. And my childhood was spent mostly outdoors. I wasn't exceptionally gifted academically, but I tended to be able to turn my hand to anything sporting. So whether from rugby, from the kind of the I suppose the brutality of rugby, both codes, league and union, all the way to the dexterity of perhaps tennis. I really enjoyed being outdoors, and yeah, kind of. I didn't expect to go here actually today, but already there's lots of fond memories coming back from my time at school, the teams that I've represented, being outdoors. And recently, very sadly, my grandfather passed. And he was a real advocate of being outdoors. And when I was putting some photos together for his eulogy and wake, one of the things that I came across was lots of photos from my childhood, and running around, jumping over peat bogs and kind of throwing rocks into streams, and being on the side of fells. So if people are listening to this and can't see it at the moment, I've got a huge smile on my face. So
Yeah.
thank you, Dom.
I was just gonna say, I literally was gonna say, if you can't see, there's the massive smile on your face. You can see the joy of thinking back to those memories and being outdoors. And I spoke to someone on the podcast before, Jay, who said, when did we stop having those feelings of, I want to go and climb a tree or jump in the mud or do fun things when we did when we were younger? When did it become not acceptable to do those things? Like, I do accept if you saw a grown man climbing a tree in a park, it might look quite strange, but actually that fun element is still there. And so I just thought I picked up on that. But yes, I could see the joy in your face. At the beginning of this podcast will be an introduction around who you are. But I want to get it in your words of, who is Dan Stanley and how would you describe what you do now and the journey that you're on?
Yeah. I'm going to start with a quote, Dom. I think this is probably the best way to articulate who I am and why I am the person that I've become. So Einstein said that adversity introduces a man to himself. And in 2017, to the outside world, I was kind of a man doing well. I was a retired award-winning Army commando, a national sporting champion, and I was successful in terms of business. I was married to a beautiful woman. I was a new father for the first time. And to the outside world, everything kind of looked like, I was playing, like ticking the boxes in the things that society expects us to accumulate as we go through this kind of journey of life. But the reality was that I didn't really know who I was. I felt unfulfilled. I was kind of just getting caught up in societal success, earning the money and spending that on success symbols that people associate successful people to have, like a detached house and a German car. And the reality was that I kind of felt almost shameful that I kind of collected all of these things. I'd achieved all of these accomplishments by the grand old age of kind of 34, 35, and felt really unfulfilled. I felt as though I didn't have the ability to communicate that I wasn't sure who I was, or even the fact that I was enjoying my life, because everybody else was kind of living in this kind of this rapid pace of life and societal success. And I kind of felt that something was off for me. And I didn't communicate it. I didn't talk about it. Unfortunately, I kind of fell back on the kind of conditioning that lots of young men experience, and that I manned up instead of opening up. And that the adversity that I experienced nearly cost me my marriage and my sanity. But the space that I created on the other side, when I realized that, I wasn't the only middle-aged man that kind of is living this kind of life, but actually felt a real sense of lack, and almost kind of an imprisonment, because I kind of created a wave of momentum in a certain direction, that I kind of felt like I couldn't really get off the wave that I was riding. But inevitably I did. I'm sure we'll go into facets of that today, and I'm really happy to share my story. But ultimately, who I am now, I am a facilitator. I enable good men to live better lives, and whether that's through my coaching practice, which is called Better Men, through the work that I do with Men and Mountains, my community project, or through the book that I've just released called Rethinking Masculinity, I'm essentially, I believe, making it permissible for men to take stock of where they're at and to choose to live differently. Because I really believe that, life's a journey. We only get one ticket, and if we don't use our time wisely, ultimately we'll end up at a place of regret and perhaps sadness on an opportunity that we've missed.
Loads of things to pick up there, but one of the things that I'd like to highlight to begin with is that going through life, picking up different societal or personal gratifications, like you said, the car, the house, a wife, a partner, but that realization of, okay, maybe this isn't actually what's, am I really happy? That questioning of everything, is that a gradual thing, or is that something that one day you wake up and it hits you like a ton of bricks?
But what a great question. Am I really happy? Well, am I really happy? I think it's kind of a gradual thing. I think that although we're talking specifically here about the agenda as men, what we're really talking about is societal issues, because almost the outdoors is in many respects is the polar opposite to the life that many of us are now conditioned to live, and I think that's a great question. Something that I often ask when I'm speaking is, very simply to start an engagement and a conversation is, why is it that so many professionally successful people aren't happy in the lives that they live? And I think the answer to that question is that we're out of alignment. The things that make humans happy and fulfilled and give them this sense of purpose, they're almost now things that we just take for granted. Our health, our happiness, our relationships. Very often we just get caught up in the busyness of life, that we just don't commit any time, effort, or attention to the things that actually make a life worth living. And it was Socrates, going all the way back to Stoicism. He said, "Beware the barrenness of a busy life." And I think because so many of us are busy now, our lives are barren.
And we sometimes ignore those important elements of life, whether that be social interaction or exercise. Like, it's so easy to go through, when you get into that hamster wheel of a career and going towards something. And again, like I said earlier, there's that pressure at the moment to really be on top of everything and reach that next promotion or whatever, that we forget the interaction, social, like productive social interaction outside of work and getting outside and being active, that falls below all of those things. And I think it's really interesting. I want to go into this later, but your book, which you kindly sent to me, in part of it was talking about how actually, and we've had this from Jay on the podcast before, that when we meet people, the first thing that we talk about is, what do you do for a living? And what do you do? Yeah. What's your job? And you quantify someone based on their job rather than what actually might be making them happy. And I found that really interesting to think about. And how do you find? I mean, your job before embarking on this journey was quite active, award-winning commando. But for people that are not in that lifestyle, what's your suggestion for how they can bring those priorities back up to the top?
Yeah, I think perhaps a starting point would be to be able to define success in our own terms. Stepping away from societal success, about collecting these societal symbols, and even the language you use around like the trappings of success. It's lonely at the top. All of the words and the vocabulary kind of give a lot away, and often because we're in that fast, rapid pace of life, we don't slow down and actually consider what would make us successful. And I think there's a juncture, particularly around that kind of 30 to 40 age bracket, where if we kind of get caught up in a rat race, where we're kind of being promoted, we're earning higher sums of money. If we're not using that to support the type of life that we want to live, but we're spending it on bigger mortgages and more expensive cars, then ultimately we can kind of trap ourselves in a rock and a hard place. This feeling of wanting change, but feeling unable to take any or make any. And Tony Robbins, the kind of personal development guru, he says, the ultimate failure is success without fulfillment. The ultimate failure is success without fulfillment. And that's why it's really important that we can define success. And that piece around, self-care has become such a meme now on Instagram or TikTok or dare I say even on LinkedIn, where I'm pretty active. It's people just take it for granted. But for me in the book, when I'm talking about self-care, I'm putting it in a way that's tangible for people to kind of really to really make it a priority in their own lives. There's 4 key areas for me, Don. The first is sleep. And sleep's like a Swiss Army knife. If we don't take the opportunity to put our head on a pillow and have a thorough night's sleep, even if it's just 7 hours, that the business of our mind and the franticness of our lives is going to catch up with us. Nutrition, again, it's a cliche. People, we've been told you are what you eat, but it's true. And if we're snacking on convenience food and fitting meals in between emails and this fast-paced life, inevitably our body's not going to have the sustenance that it needs to really perform and to be healthy. On top of that, there's movement. And for me, movement's medicine, which is why I love being outdoors so much. That can be as simple as just taking a dog or my children for a walk in the woods at the back of the house, or it can be out on a walk with men in mountains. But I really do believe that movement is medicine. And the fourth part of this for me is around connection. It's the happiness the Harvard happiness study looks at what is it that makes a life worth living, and it's a longitudinal study that looks at men's lives between the ages of 20, and I think a few people got to 100 by the time they kind of closed this study off, and they were looking at what enables people to enjoy their lives. And ultimately, happiness comes from connection with other people. So that's the fourth pillar. So sleep, nutrition, movement, and connection. And I think if we get those four things right, and we really choose to make them a priority. And the point around priorities is that they can shift. There's going to be times in our lives where work has to take preference, or there's a family commitment that means that we maybe have to not train or not do something in a certain way. But having the flexibility instead of the rigidity around how we live our lives is really important. And I think if we concentrate on those four areas, the sleep, the nutrition, the movement, the connection, we live a life that's worth living.
It's interesting. I mean, those four, if you again, the focus is on those four will help people just to start to get those realigns, and then obviously it's not about rigidness, flexibility. And it's interesting what you said earlier about how people go through that hamster wheel of life, and they get to a certain age where they're then earning a certain amount of money, but they're not feeling that fulfillment. I mean, I've seen on your social media statistically that the demographic of 40 to 59-year-old men are the most anxious and the least happy in the UK. Do you think this is because they're getting to that point where they are financially secure and they're starting to be in that, that upper echelon, hopefully of life, where they're then realizing, oh, actually, I've been going nonstop, almost tunnel vision, and now it's all starting to hit home?
Yeah. The foundation of societal success is built on sand. I think in that age group, kind of that range, 40 to 50, there's a real recognition then that we end up at what Tony Robbins calls the ultimate failure, the success without fulfillment. And it comes back to, that formative conditioning that we all experience, Dom. And, I think people will be able to really connect with this, because whether it's through societal conditioning, educational conditioning, or parental conditioning, there's an expectation that boys will be a certain way. And I kind of look at this through three distinct labels. The first is that we are to be strong. This kind of this narrative that boys don't cry, and man up, big boys. All this kind of conditioning we experience in our formative years kind of makes us believe that we have to be strong all of the time. But when all you've got is strength to overcome the challenges that life creates for us, if all we've got is strength and we haven't got any left, then ultimately we're going to fall really short. The next part for me is to be silent. It's a little bit like Fight Club. The first rule of Fight Club is that you don't talk about it. It's the same for men. The kind of superficial exchanges that people have either in bars or coffee shops, or around the water cooler at work. How are you? Yeah, not too bad, or okay, or could be worse. It's so superficial that we kind of reinforce that piece around men not talking, which actually is a complete fallacy. And then the third part, which is really relevant to what we're talking about here, is that men are expected to be the breadwinners. And even though in a quarter of homes now across the UK, it's actually the female or the wife or the partner that's actually the breadwinner, men are still conditioned at a young age that they have to be successful. And that's why so much of our identity gets caught up in our profession or our occupation. And it's like you said earlier, when people are introduced to each other, it's all, what do you do, is a very quick question that comes around. And it's like almost a way of quantifying whether somebody's worthy of our time or whether we think that we'll connect with them. But never when I've been outdoors on the side of a fell or a mountain has anybody ever said to me very quickly in short proximity, "Oh, what do you do?" That's just not even relevant when you're on the side of a mountain. You're talking about where you've been, what you've experienced, perhaps other adventures that you've encountered. But what you do for your occupation just isn't in the conversation.
Yeah, I want to put a pin in that, because I know we're going to go into a certain direction with that idea of masculinity. Okay. I've got questions to ask around that, but almost in a similar vein. But I want to also bring it back to you, so people can still get that idea around you, who you are, and what has brought you here today. I mean, you've sporting champion, and you've played rugby. You've been a businessman. Like I said, Army commando. They're different elements that can be quite masculine and fueled environments. what effect do you think that lifestyle, particularly in the army, because we've had people that have been in that industry and that have come onto the podcast before, that effect had on you, and what have you learned from being in those areas?
Yeah, I think that I'm really against the idea of masculinity being toxic, but I do feel it is dysfunctional. You know, when we're talking about the challenges of modern day men, like you mentioned then, that the quote from the book, or the reference from the book, that men aged between that age range are the most anxious in the UK. Also, that between the ages of 46 and 49 is the most average age of divorce. More men now get prostate cancer than women get breast cancer, but very few will talk about their experience with prostate because of the shame and embarrassment, the stigma that comes a lot associated with that kind of disease. So yeah, kind of, I don't really distinguish any difference, though, Dom, between military, sport, and corporate. I think that there's all this kind of competitive edge where the person that sacrifices the most life ultimately climbs the ladder faster than anybody else, or gets to the top. And you know, it's such a cliche, isn't it? But we need to make sure the ladder we're climbing is against the right wall, and it's worth climbing in the first place.
It's interesting you brought up toxic masculinity, and you kind of started to touch on your idea around that, because that's a phrase that's thrown around a lot at the moment. So what's your thoughts around that?
Yeah, it's you know, when we look at statistics around modern day masculinity, for me it's a real concern, not just for the men of our era, but ultimately what we're going to pass on in the form of our legacy. You know, what will we be remembered for, the men of today? You know, our crisis arguably could be the pandemic, and when we look at off the back of the pandemic, the concern now around kind of poor mental health, around financial instability. We've got war in Europe, you know, for the first time in decades. It's, you know, it's such a challenging time to be a man, particularly now with, you know, the change culturally and societally now with female empowerment, which I'm a real advocate of. I think that, you know, the whole piece around polarization is a mistake. You know, we shouldn't be championing just one gender and oppressing the other. We should all be lifting each other up. And yeah, I got a real issue with when people say masculinity is toxic, because masculinity for me is a certain set of traits that's passed on from one generation of men to the next. And I think that the dysfunction of what worked for men of a previous generation is dysfunctional for ours. Proving our worth through our work now sets men up to fail, particularly in that second half of their lives where they've ticked a lot of the boxes, but they haven't got any of the feelings they expected to accompany their success. And then because of the conditioning we spoke about earlier, the strong, the silent, the successful, lots of men are kind of floating around that middle age bracket with a real sense of uncertainty about who they are and who they want to become in their futures. And it's almost as if, well, I've ticked these boxes, I've achieved these goals, and now I don't know who I am. And I'm almost afraid to set new goals and to put myself out there, because this has felt like a failure once. What happens if it feels the same again? So yeah, kind of when I was writing Rethinking Masculinity, the first chapter really cemented my belief around the dysfunction of modern day masculinity. And I focused the first chapter, firstly around the conditioning we experience, but then secondly on what I call the top 5 challenges affecting modern day masculinity. And the first one for me is workaholism. Workaholism and burnout, they kind of go hand in hand. Lots of people don't realize it, but the kind of their attachment to work and the over-indexing of their professional career over other areas of their lives actually means that they're probably workaholics, but they've never really realized it. And when we look now at statistics around burnout, somewhere at any given time, actually depending on the time of the year, affects how people feel in terms of burnout. Maybe the weather's got a part to play with it, but somewhere between 35 and 40% of UK professionals feel like they're close to burnout or burned out in the past. You know, it's quite an astonishing statistic, really. After burnout, because we're overworking and we're underliving, which is a real belief that I have from the work that I do, a lot of men end up lonely in their own lives. You know, kind of the friendships that they formed either when they were through either the youth or through university, you know, kind of in many cases now they're 10, 20, even 30 years ago that these friendships were closely formed and tight. But because people just don't have the time to commit to the friendships, they end up in a place where they either stay at a very superficial level because there's no real depth or intimacy in those relationships, or they actually feel very lonely. And it was the charity Mind published some anonymized data, and in that data it said a third of UK men don't have a best friend, which for me is, wow, you know, it's really painful, because ultimately when there's some kind of adversity in our life, whether it's a bereavement or a job loss or some difficulties in a relationship, we want to have people stood by our sides, our friends, to support us through those. So between workaholism, loneliness, the next one on top of that is poor mental health, because when we don't have a safe space to share our experience, and whether that is just to vent how we're feeling or to seek some advice and support, the reality is that we can become fearful of our future and anxious, or we become regretful or uncertain of our past and then become depressed. Because we're not dealing with any of the issues we're speaking about here, Dom, lots of men, like I did, end up in midlife almost and have this kind of crisis, this loss of identity, this uncertainty about is the life they're living right for them? And then because we don't talk about the midlife crisis, and we'll usually try to numb it or avoid it, or just kind of avoid the reality of our situation, for those that are married or in relationships, there's a likelihood that they will end up in a place of divorce because their wives will be looking at them or their partners are looking at them thinking, well, where is my husband or my partner gone? And most often, Dom, he's probably gone into his head and never come out, trying to overthink and cerebrally force his way through his life problems. But the issue with that is that, our thinking creates our experience and our reality. So if we're not thinking new thoughts and we're just marinating ourselves in kind of procrastination and rumination, then we're just kind of in this self-perpetuating loop of problem with never any solution.
It was interesting you presented the 5 key challenges in almost a chronological order of how they may start to manifest over time, and how it's not all of a sudden these 5 issues are hitting you all at once. It might drift through, like you said, working hard, getting burnout, then feeling that loneliness, and then your poor mental health starts to work into it, which then leads to midlife crisis, divorce. And it's really interesting because we're speaking about it, but it's actually sometimes can be a process. And look, it might be things that hit at different times in individual cases, but actually I can see how that would start to go through that. And it just picking up on your story with that how that affected you. What was it that point? Was it, I'm sure I read on your website, it's around the birth of your first child where it started to really come home?
Yeah. I despite doing kind of parental workshops, there's an element of naivety on my part. Nobody'd really prepared me for becoming a new parent. That the weight of responsibility, the additional time, or the time that you would lose from the things that you once enjoyed, that now would be refocused into looking after a child and being a parent. I was just completely caught like a rabbit in the headlights. All of a sudden, my time to train and be outdoors, my ski trips, all the things that I used to love doing, all of a sudden were kind of like they weren't available to me. And what I didn't realize is that my busyness in sport and in exercise actually was probably a bit of a tonic for this feeling of discomfort that I had inside myself. And I mentioned before, like, lots of men will run away from their problems. Whenever I see an Ironman badge, I often think, well, I wonder where that person has got 10 to 15 hours a week to train in order to go and do that Ironman. And what is it, the real motivation? Is it, do they want the badge? Do they want the kudos? Or are they avoiding something in their lives? And for me, kind of becoming a parent for the first time was kind of the beginning of what can only be described as a breakdown. As I spoke about, I kind of manned up instead of opening up. And I realized I pretty much spent 34 years pretending to be the person that I felt others wanted me to be. And my success, despite it being multifaceted, both personally and professionally, was really superficial, Dom. And eventually, when I started peeling back those layers, and I'll share this with you. It's actually a great story. So my wife and I were separated for around 8 months, and kind of naively, when we decided to rebuild our marriage, we went off to the Maldives on a bit of a make or break holiday. The idea was to take all our marital baggage to the Maldives, out to the Indian Ocean, leave all that shit there, and come back happily married. And whilst it didn't happen in that way, what did happen was a real moment of synchronicity that changed the direction of my life. So I'm an avid reader, always have been, and sat on this white sandy beach looking out over the Indian Ocean. I was reading a book called Legacy. It's about the culture of the All Blacks and what made them the most successful sporting team in the world. And a few sunbeds down, there's a guy, I didn't recognize him at the time, but he was reading Chimp Paradox, about how the mind works and how we got to manage our chimps to live our lives. And he kind of leant over after a few days, Dom, and he said, "We must be the only two guys in the Maldives reading self-help books. What's your story?" And I tried to bat him away with a bit of humour, but he was persistent. So we ended up grabbing a beer, sitting on the beach. And at this point in my life, I'd never heard a man speak with such emotional expressiveness. I've got, again, a bit of an issue around the term vulnerability. I don't think men want to be vulnerable, to feel exposed. But if we're being expressive, which is a completely human thing to do, to express how we're feeling and how we're thinking, I think that's a really healthy thing to do. So this guy went on to share his life's journey, his story, how he had been a Premiership footballer playing for one of the big London clubs, living in a penthouse, driving sports cars, and how he'd had this kind of high-paid, high-flying lifestyle. And after 2 knee operations, which hadn't worked, he kind of spiraled into gambling and drugs and prostitutes. And, he shared his story, Don, with a real level of openness, one that I'd never experienced from my family, from time in the military, or from anybody I'd ever met, even coaches or mentors in sport. And he turned to me on this beach, and you could even see the tips of the reef sharks swimming around the house reef. And he said to me, the only difference between a grave and a rut, is the depth. And at that point in my life, the most profound experience I'd ever encountered. And I kind of walked back across the beach to my wife, Rachel. She was reading a magazine. And I said, when we get home, I'm going to shut my business down. And she sort of looked up but didn't say anything, and which was exactly what I needed, because at the time I didn't have any of the answers. But she fell asleep on the connecting flight from Dubai back to Heathrow, and I wrote an exit plan for my business, and that was it. I kind of pressed pause on an unfulfilling, superficial life, and kind of spent my divorce fund on repurposing and retraining as a coach. I spent time out in the States. I spent time in London. I put myself on retreats and courses, and started to really own my story and to share it with others, in the hope that, that we can really do what my book is titled, to rethink masculinity, because I think the gender conditioning that we experience as young men and as young boys kind of sets us up to fail, particularly in the second half of our lives.
It's amazing. I mean, that story is amazing, but it just shows how, that's a very top level, a massive impact on your life. But just speaking
Absolutely.
about something, and like you said, you tried to bat it away with a comedic response, and which a lot of people will do, of try and do that and play it down with humor. But actually, once you started to open up and have that interaction with someone who's gone through, in their own story, a similar rut, of it makes you go, okay, it's just that, that conversation, and then it starts a new journey that you're on today, which is amazing. And then that's you trying to have an impact on other people's lives, in whether it be online or in personal talks or one-to-one coaching. And if we then boil that down to how can we think about that in a day-to-day life, it's going for a cup of tea at lunch or coffee, or going for a beer after work or on the weekend with a friend, and then having that, no, come on, let's have a conversation, let's just chat about work, relationship, whatever, for a little bit, and then we'll talk about whatever else, trying to integrate it into a full conversation. And then it's just, you might have that on a day-to-day level, that breakthrough, and just be able to feel confident talking about it. And like you said, on numerous points, it's that masculinity element that makes you go, and I'm glad you defined it, because I was going to ask you about that, of how do you define masculinity? And I like it as a sense of a set of qualities or traits that you hand down to the next generation. Because when I was preparing for this and I was writing down the questions around masculinity, and this podcast will be named Rethinking Masculinity. It can often be quite difficult to take, because some periods thought about men as, men strong, they've not got any issues, especially your stereotypical straight white male. There can't be any issues. So then you go through a period of holding back, internalizing everything, and then now it's gone the other way, where we're starting to have conversations and actually think about men's mental health, well-being, how suicide rates are so high in men. And again, picking up on what you've said before about, it's not about competing priorities. It's not actually, this is more important than this. It's trying to talk about male rethinking masculinity, but also that doesn't detract from all of the other important elements, because we talk about diversification and diversity and inclusion and female equality. It's all of these areas are so important. So for you, what I'm going to ask you again, what is masculinity? How do you define it further than the set of traits, and why do you think it can be so divisive?
Yeah. I think the reason it's divisive is because almost we don't want to believe that what men of previous generations did no longer fits our model of society. This kind of prioritization of our professional career being our strongest sense of identity, and our provision for our family being essentially security, mostly through financial sense. Keeping up with the Joneses just meant pretty much that we had to just compete against the people that we either consciously or subconsciously compete against the people that lived in our immediate vicinity. But now with the prominence of social media, kind of all the things that we used to see as kind of luxuries they're almost necessities. And I think that a lot of men are kind of falling through the gaps in terms of recognizing that there's a real need to shift. And you touched on suicide there. Statistically, the biggest threat to a man's life is himself, under the age of 45. And that in itself, between cancer, divorce and suicide and loneliness and burnout, there's enough evidence out there to really get our attention. And I'm not here with a message of hope. I never am. That's not my message, but I'm here with a message of change. For me, what's fundamentally important about masculinity is that it matures. It comes into the 21st century. What worked for men of a previous generation no longer serves us, and certainly won't serve our sons and daughters, tomorrow's men and women. We need to take responsibility for changing the narrative around masculinity. And there's a kind of my position on this is that it's kind of like when you get to a stage where you have an element or a sense of professional success, in that you can have maybe the financial security to own a home and maybe have a few things that enable your life to feel more comfortable. There's almost a need then that you change how you define your future version of masculinity. And this is where rethinking masculinity comes into its own, because it's kind of a blueprint. The old blueprint doesn't work. What I'm suggesting, based on my own experience and the hundreds of men that I've coached, all from English-speaking countries, but essentially from New York to New Zealand, usually men that are in their 30s, 40s and 50s that are kind of at a place where their professional success is causing consequence for them personally, whether that's marital conflict, whether that's a sense of loneliness or a sense of uncertainty about their future. All of them kind of follow this blueprint that enables them to then really re-engage in their life in meaningful ways. And what it starts with, Dom, on the surface sounds quite selfish, but it starts with prioritizing ourselves, making ourselves a priority in our own lives, bringing some awareness to the things that we enjoy, having the courage to not work through our lunch hour, to take a weekend off to go and see friends that we haven't seen for a while, to really do the things, even those self-care items that we spoke about earlier, to do the things that enrich our lives. Secondly, to focus our time and our effort on our relationships, and to kind of reconnect with people. On top of after making ourselves a priority and focus our time and effort on our relationships, the next part then is to use our financial resources, not to get caught up or deeper into the rat race, but to create memories that we'll never forget, to really add value to our lives and the people that are kind of dependent on us, namely our children. And then at the top of that is continuing our professional success. But instead of making that the kind of the nucleus of our identity and our sole focus and our prioritization, to kind of recognize that actually it's okay to turn our emails off. It's okay not to reply to everything that comes into our in tray. It's okay to say no. It's okay to delegate. It's okay to recognize that, another promotion or pay rise isn't going to give us what we need, because actually what we want is more time, more connection, more health, more love. They're the things that are really important. And this is my message, that ultimately when you get to a place where you are professionally successful in a societal sense, it's okay. In fact, it's necessary to pivot your definition of success and to make that, particularly in the second half of our lives, to make that your priority.
It's interesting. A lot of the elements you speak about there is a lot of it's communication and acceptance of, like you said, delegation or turning your email off, or just going, you're not going to be able to do anything all the time, that the weekends will be for you, that there's going to be time aside, and communication of, again, that aspect of talking about things, whether it be to a colleague, a friend, a family member, And I'm interested to hear your thought on this, because I guess there will be some individuals, but men, that for them, after a tough day or a tough life moment, a deep breath, sleeping, a day off, and then just going again will be good for them. And that will work for them, and that will work for a long time. But for some people that won't work. And do you think it's that acceptance that actually for some people it's not going to work, that the idea of man up, they can't just accept that actually going and speaking to a therapist, going and taking time away after burnout is actually something that should be accepted in society. For some people it will work, but it's not going to work for everyone. I think that seems where an issue sometimes comes from.
Yeah. Again, that conditioning shuts us. Also does insist no definition of masculinity that means that we kind of feel either incapable of talking or inadequate if we share our problems. But the reality is, if we don't make time for our wellness, we're forced to make time for our illness. And, unfortunately, despite having a very healthy network around me of people that I could have tapped into to kind of share kind of my challenges, when they were kind of almost, small enough to manage on my own or with some immediate family and friends, I didn't choose to do that. And in that isolation, that shame-induced isolation, my problems amplified. And, to anybody who's listening to this that's maybe got some life stuff going on at the moment, the reality is that there's probably lots of people out there that love and care about you. And it's probably your inability to express what's going on, either because of fear or shame or embarrassment, that kind of keeps you trapped in this place of discomfort. And, I tried counseling. I found it was too passive. I tried therapy. I kind of felt it was too slow. And then I engaged with a coach. And I found, for me, kind of coming from an outdoor background, military and sport, kind of just wanting to find a bloody answer to this problem that I was experiencing, I found that pragmatic approach really useful. But again, unless you try counseling, try therapy, try coaching, you won't know what the solution is to the challenges that you're experiencing. And kind of sitting in that space of inertia isn't going to change anything.
So I can imagine, and I have had friends that are aware that these outlets, signposts are there for talking and going to see someone professionally to talk about their issues, but actually it's the step to knock on the door, to drive to that location, to pick up the phone to do it. It's actually the step there to those signposted areas that can be quite tough. So what's your advice for people that are struggling to take that step?
Just do it. Just do it. Just pick up the phone, send somebody an email, just take that first step. And almost immediately, if the person that you reached out to is competent and qualified, they will create a space where you feel completely safe sharing all of the stuff that's just beneath the surface. And taking our hands off all the things that we're trying to push down and hide, and just letting it out. And sometimes that can come out, it feels like we're emotionally vomiting over somebody, but the reality is that when we let all of that stuff out, it's a real sense of decompression and a sense of liberation. In that space is often where we access the solutions that will enable us to move our life forward. So just do it. Stop procrastinating, stop ruminating, stop putting it off. Just make the call, send the email, and I can guarantee almost that everything that you want, you will access through having one or two conversations.
Metaphorically, it's like jumping in a cold pool, isn't it? It's that one little jump, and yes, it will be a cold water shock, but it, like I said, just do it. And having someone there with you to hold your hand to jump in the pool, or to take you to the first session, or to be available after you've had that first phone call with someone to just decompress with, or have a cup of tea with, that's also very helpful as well. I've found that I know people that have said, oh, can you come with me, or have taken a sibling or a friend. I just need that little bit of almost a push in the back, and that's a massive step as well. So it's take big deep breath in, just do it. Going back to those 5 key challenges of masculinity, and we could dive into all of them for a very, very long time. But I mean, there might not be an answer for this, but if we were thinking about it in that sort of chronological order, and starting with workaholism and burnout, how would someone approach trying to cut that off at the source? And I know that's not how it works, but if you were trying to look at it in a simple fashion, workaholism, burnout, what steps you would take to, or what approaches do you take to try and cut those potential issues off at the source of that area?
Yeah. So we're essentially taught what to think, not how to think, Dom. And what a lot of us are never even exposed to is the reality that our thoughts create our experience of life. And something I often share with my clients is that our life follows the direction of our strongest thoughts. So from this kind of formative age, I call it the myth of masculinity, the belief that professional success equals personal happiness. So almost everybody's trying to get a place where they can be happy in their lives. And for most men, there's a belief that the way that they get to happiness is through professional success, through kind of the kudos of their position, through earning more money so they can have these luxury items that enrich their lives. But the reality is that our beliefs then drive our behavior. So how we think dictates how we feel dictates what we do, and what we do over a period of time creates who we become. And the reality is, if we change our thoughts, around what it is that success looks like to us, we almost by default then change our life trajectory, and that in turn will change our behaviors. So if we step away from thinking that professional success equals personal happiness, and then we start to realize that actually spending time with good people, being outdoors, investing in our health is actually, and our happiness is where success comes from, and we start diarizing that into our diary, and making those things a higher priority. And I know people might be listening to this now and being, fairly skeptical, thinking, well, that's really hard to do. Like, the thing that makes change hard is ourselves. It's our resistance to letting go of that part of our identity. But it's kind of like, what got you here isn't going to get you there. And that's why so many men kind of fall into this trap in midlife. And I think it's a real travesty. So to answer your question, I think that I'll share this. I think it's probably relevant to our conversation. I asked a client earlier on this year, a really good guy, very keen snowboarder, is actually now able to take his son snowboarding to an age where they can kind of really enjoy the sort of winter pursuits. I asked this client, he's a great guy, I said, other than money, what makes a man's life rich? And other than money, what makes a man's life rich? And within a few minutes, this guy, he got really emotional in this question, because he realized the things that make a man's life rich, for him in this case, were just outside his home office. It was his wife, it was his sons, it was his dog, it was accessing nature, which was on his doorstep. And he realized that because of his prioritization of work and being a partner in the company that he was a part of, that actually he was financially rich, but he was poor in so many other areas. And it was in that moment of realization that kind of shook him, that gave him the ability to kind of repurpose his sense of success. And, this is going back sort of 6-9 months now, and seeing the tangible changes in this guy's life, because he decided to redefine what success for him meant in this next chapter of his life, allowed him not to step away from his corporate career, but enabled him to really invest his time, his effort and energy into the people that really make his life rich.
Wow, it's interesting to hear that, especially that idea of what makes him happy, or what provides that richness aside from money is the other side of his work office in his house. Really interesting. So that's the source of workaholism, burnout. Jumping to the other end, of people that unfortunately would have gone through that process, or might have gone through that element, and then where actually they have fully gone through divorce and they're in a different chapter of their life. How can people start to take steps to try and regain some, I don't know what the right phrase is, control might not be the right phrase, but some happiness, and to take forward steps after potentially having been through all those negative processes?
Yeah. But 42% of marriages end in divorce now, which is another statistic that's, it's really hard to reconcile, because the collateral consequences of divorce are multifaceted, between not just financial but also emotional, and then there's the complexities then of kind of moving on with life, and that's why I think that the outdoors, and my introduction to you came from being at the Outdoor Expo last year at the NEC, which was fantastic. Never have I been in a space for such a low value ticket price, where I could hear so many people sharing their journeys, not just their outdoor journeys, but of their lives. And, people talk about how success leaves clues. Well, so does failure. And I think if we get so caught up in the way that society defines success, that we can almost, because of statistics and data we've been sharing here, Dom, you can almost guarantee that you're gonna result in some kind of failure that's going to impact your life. But on the flip side of that, success can leave clues. And when you look at people that spend time outdoors, they're fit, they're happy, they're healthy, you don't have to have a weathered face and to spend that much time outdoors to benefit from nature. But, I really believe, as I said earlier, movement is medicine. And, create some space for yourself. Put it in your diary. If your life is dictated by your diary or your calendar, put space in there for yourself. A couple of hours a week, go and walk, go and talk, go and spend time with good people, go and do things that add value to your life. And often we make the barrier of enjoying our lives exceptionally high. There's going to be parks in cities, there's going to be places that we can get to probably within an hour of our houses. Just get out there, move, connect, to spend time with people that are potentially further ahead in their journey, like maybe a journey that you're on now, and maybe tap into their knowledge, understand what is it that's enabled them to be successful, maybe after they've come through an adverse or an uncomfortable experience.
There are so many men that are going to get so much value from this conversation, but I also want there to be value for partners, siblings, kin, friends to take from this as well that might not be a man, but also to get value. So how can people potentially identify, support, be a part of that process if they're not a man going through this, these issues that we've spoken about?
Yeah, it's a lot of people, particularly ladies, are finding it hard because when they see their husbands or their partners or their colleagues or their siblings kind of with those obvious signs of stress or irritability or an inability to be present and in the room, it's really hard, or it can feel really hard then to help those people. I think a common mistake that people fall into is trying to fix things for people, trying to give them answers and solutions. Well, I think a real better thing to do here, or a more useful exercise, is to create the space to have a conversation. And sometimes the best way to start that conversation, Dom, is to share first about maybe a challenge or something that's uncomfortable, or maybe that wouldn't be a superficial topic of conversation. And after you've shared what's going on in your life behind the fake smiles and the facades of everything's okay, the likelihood is that the other person then might have the capacity or the incentive to share what's going on in their life. So instead of trying to fix and to poke and ask, share first. Create an environment where then somebody else might feel safe to share what they've got going on, and just keep opening the space up. Ask them kind of to invite them into that space.
Rethinking Masculinity. I'm aware of time, but
yep.
Who's this book aimed at? Because it will provide so much value to someone who is identifiably in those sections, but also for someone like myself who is relatively at the beginning of their career, who might not be aware of all of this in the form that we've spoken about it. It's providing a lot of value for me of potentially identification and signposting and understanding where either myself or a friend might be starting to hit, that burnout point, or other areas of loneliness or poor mental health. So is that the idea behind it? Is actually, okay, you can get value as a 50-year-old man who's been through that hamster wheel that we've spoken about, but also it will provide value for anyone.
Yeah. I think the subtitle is a modern man's guide to succeeding in life. So straight away, because of the content of the book, it really is, it's a point of reference for any man that has either experienced a setback, finds himself stagnant in the second half of his life, or is perhaps questioning, is this it? But then more laterally, I've had a lot of interest from HR directors that are kind of looking at their senior leadership teams, which are predominantly still in this day and age male, kind of looking at, well, how can we get our teams, our male teams, to perform better? And instead of trying to drive their performance through metrics and KPIs, but how can they become healthier and happier? And how will that translate into the bottom line in a workplace? But it's a book for anybody that cares about men, whether that's as themselves, friends, colleagues, siblings, loved ones, wives, even mothers, for anybody that has an interest in enabling men to live happier, healthier, more fulfilling lives.
And a funny photo that I saw on your social media that I would have, which has an important message, is burying your head in the sand. And it was a person laid down burying their head in the sand. And whilst it's a funny point and a funny image, it has an important message with it, which is quite literally, if you bury your head in the sand and if you block out all of these thoughts and internalize everything, that eventually it will build up and build up. And I just wanted to get your comments on that.
Yeah. I sometimes I refer to that middle age of masculinity as kind of the silent majority. There's so many men out there that just aren't enjoying the lives that they've created because they don't talk about it and they bury their head in the sand. That in the hope that when they lift their head out like an ostrich, all their problems will have disappeared. Unfortunately, that's not how life works. And often the avoidance compounds the problem that people are experiencing. So kind of don't be an ostrich. Get outdoors.
And I mean, there's been so much to talk about that. Just before I ask, your advice for the next guest, and also where people can go to find out more and about rethinking masculinity, tell me about Men and Mountains, because again, that's a whole section that we could have had half an hour on. But tell me what it is, how people could get involved, and where it came from, and why it's so important.
Yeah, so very succinctly, it's a community of like-minded men that recognise the importance of taking time out from the pressures and challenges of modern day life to walk and talk and connect with other like-minded men in nature. So our geographical hub is in the Brecon Beacons. I live an hour from the Beacons, so it's my kind of my backyard, so to speak. We meet on a Sunday. It's run through a WhatsApp group. At the minute, there's about 380 men that are a part of Men and Mountains. They don't all walk and talk at the same time. I think our biggest walk was 44 men. There's no cost, no commitment. People can come either as a point of importance for them or as their diary allows or dictates. But ultimately, it's a peer group, and what we find in that space when we're walking and talking, it's not so much about the fitness, although people do need to be able to cover sort of 8 to 10 miles off-road undulating terrain. It's a place for men to share their experiences, and what we find in that space of shared experience and understanding is that it almost becomes more permissible to share kind of the problems or the challenges that men are experiencing. And our last walk in November, the question or the topic of conversation was, what is a challenge or a problem that you feel that you need to lean into before the end of the year? And to hear, men that are, kind of stereotyped as being, not being good at talking, sharing their experiences, either marital conflict, challenges in work, parental issues, there's all these conversations were coming to a surface, because men felt safe and able to do so. So I love it. It's one of my favorite parts of the month when there's a body of men gathered and you can feel that kind of nervous anticipation, because all they essentially know is the start point, and roughly we'll cover 8 to 10 miles. And then we kind of go off on this adventure, usually off-piste, staying away from the main sort of tourist spots of the Brecon Beacons, finding waterfalls or re-entrance or little gullies, or being out on the side of a mountain and no one else is around us, and doing that. And then obviously the pint at the end, Dom, is very refreshing and rehydrating.
Oh, absolutely. I can imagine. So definitely social media and Google, have a look for that if that sounds of interest to find out more. But then also Rethinking Masculinity, and just you, Dan, where can people go to find out about the book, and which contains so much more and builds on so much that what we've spoken about today?
Thank you, Don. Yeah, my website's the best place. It's better-men.uk, better-men.uk. And on there, then people can join Men and Mountains. There's a very simple registration form on a webpage. And also for my book as well. I didn't realize this when I was writing Rethinking Masculinity, but 65% of the cost of a book on Amazon goes to Jeff Bezos. So kind of it. And now, because of the pandemic and war in Europe, the cost of a new paperback that's recently published is between $11 and $14.99, which is exceptionally high. So it's on my website, and I'm asking people to just cover the postage. So if people sign up for the book on my website and pay the £3 to post it, I'll send them a copy at no cost to themselves in that sense. So and that's, it's not just a marketing gimmick, Don. For me, it's really important, because I think that if we don't rethink masculinity, the men of our generation, ultimately we're going to pass on the same challenges to tomorrow's men and women. And I think it's a real travesty when we look at the statistics around burnout, divorce, suicide. it's not toxic, but it is dysfunctional, and we all have a responsibility, both the men of today and the society today, to really address this.
Absolutely. And for that reason, that's why I wanted to get you onto this podcast to talk about this important topic. And thank you so much for providing that insight and tangible things that people can take away. I think that's so important as well. So thank you for jumping on the podcast. I appreciate it. And make sure you go and check out more stuff about Rethinking Masculinity, Men in Mountains, and Dan as well. But the final thing from you that I need is, I gave you a piece of advice at the beginning, is a piece of advice from you, Dan, for someone coming on the podcast in the near future.
I'm going to share a quote, and I'm going to make this gender neutral, but it's a Confucius. There was a Chinese philosopher. Confucius said, a man has two lives. The second begins when he realizes he only has one. So what I want to pass on to the next guest is that as human beings, we have two lives, but the second begins when we only realize we have one.
That's amazing. Dan, thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you, Don. It's been a pleasure.